So I share Sue's view that business tax research is very important. We can identify two benefits that we get from better understanding through research. One is, of course, that we get better tax policies. I think we all understand that. The second is that we probably get better public understanding of the tax system too. To be sure, the public understanding lags what research knows. And I do think sometimes that we need sophisticated research to enlighten propositions that we don't really need research for now. Meaning, Reuven, my colleague Reuven Avi-Yonah raised the issue of the incidence of the corporation tax. Who really bears the burden of the corporation tax? And there's terrific work that's been done by the center, and there's work that's been done by others on trying to figure out which parties bear the burden of business taxes. But here's what we know for sure, is that somebody bears the burden of business taxes. That is not considered controversial proposition in the tax community, but it's not a fully accepted proposition in the world at large. And if we had better research on who actually bears the burden of the business tax, then it would help, I believe, the public as a whole to understand that at least someone is bearing this burden, and therefore you might want to factor that into your advocacy. We have learned a lot about business taxation over the last 25 years, and I have to say the pace has picked up enormously in the last 10 years. In particular by efforts of the Center for Business Taxation here. I mean, they've done a marvelous job, and it's really providing a public good for the world as a whole, because the lessons that you get from the research projects that have come out of Oxford, have been valuable to the United States and lots of other countries in thinking about their tax policies. There's been so much interest and agitation in this area recently. I'm reminded that I met my wife almost about 30 years ago, and she likes to tell me now that I used to complain when we first met that no one was talking about international tax issues. And now I complain that everyone is talking about international tax issues. So we need better research to enlighten that talk. I have 4 areas of research that I would love to see the center, provide answers to. The first is this question of who bears the burden of business taxes, who bears the burden of the corporate tax. I like to say that if I had 10 questions to ask God, the first question would already be answered. But one of the other 10 questions would be, what is the incidence of the corporation income tax? I certainly don't know the answer yet. I'm sure he or she does, but they're not telling. It's important, of course, for all sorts of reasons. All of today we've talked about the issues of fairness, and the issues of tax fairness have gotten much more acute, in part because of austerity, in part because of a changing income distribution in Western countries. And there's a very strong incentive for governments to try to design their policies with an eye to this changing distribution of income. One of the things that we lose from that discussion, I fear, is that the world as a whole has experienced a change in the distribution of income. What we see in Britain or America tends to be our small piece of the entire world pie. But it's important not to lose sight of the fact that over the last 20 years, you've had the most dramatic reduction in poverty the world has ever seen. It's the change in world distribution of income has been simply marvelous from an equity perspective. It's just that it feels painful in countries like the United States or the United Kingdom because within the country, you're seeing a widening of the income distribution, even though around the world, you're seeing a leveling of the income distribution because you've got this rising affluence in heretofore very poor Asian countries. Last summer, I was on a panel in a conference in France, and there were 3 European speakers, then a former Indian finance official, and then I was the last speaker. The 3 European speakers were talking about the problems of capitalism and how awful it has been in recent years and the challenges of capitalism basically in Western Europe. The fourth speaker was this Indian finance official, and he was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Capitalism is the greatest thing that has ever happened to India. Before we had capitalism, we had massive poverty and infant mortality and everything else. And we still have, in India, too much of that, but it's been dramatically reduced, and it's been dramatically reduced associated with the introduction of widespread capitalism. So when we think about these income distribution issues, we don't want to lose sight of the many beneficial things that we have gotten from a period of expansion of capitalism and globalization. But you do have to be aware of the social consequences within what are otherwise very high income countries. So the first issue is tax fairness and distribution of tax burdens. Second issue is the effect of business taxation on job creation and destruction. This is, of course, a very difficult issue for economic research. And the reason it's a difficult issue is that the standard microeconomic model, which is what we use in taxation, is one where there is no unemployment. So if there is no unemployment, then there really isn't an issue of job creation or job destruction. I'm sure that's reassuring to the unemployed, that proposition. But the fact is, we talk a lot in taxation about competitiveness. And competitiveness is a real thing. Competitiveness corresponds, if it's true, it corresponds to job creation and job preservation. So, okay, let's analyze how many jobs you get by having a better corporate tax system than a worse corporate tax system. There must be an answer to that question. I don't know what it is, but Mike, put that down on your list. So there has to be an answer. The next issue is actually something that has already been raised in the panel, revenue forecasting. To a first approximation, nobody does research on revenue forecasting. If we have a tax change, what revenue will that generate? If you say the UK changed its corporate tax rate from 20% to 23%, how much revenue would you get? Well, people do projections, but they don't do research on those projections. And the reason is it's hard. The other reason is that governments, of course, are charged with producing estimates, and it's true in the United States too. And in the United States, the methods that they use are kept secret. Things that are secret cannot be studied. And they're kept secret because of a desire to avoid having advocates get involved in the process of revenue estimation. But also it's a rather convenient way not to be criticized, too. We need to open up revenue estimation processes and allow and encourage people to do research on it. If we do research on it, we'll get better answers. We'll have a better idea. For example, we're having this controversy this week with Greece about, they want to, obviously, people in Europe are talking to the Greek government about you got to get more revenue and do all of this. But, and Greece has got some proposals about, we're going to get revenue by making companies pay more tax. If we had good research on what effect, the proposals would have, then you'd have a better idea of whether it was actually true or how much additional revenue you would get. So let's take it out of the secrecy, do some research, and figure out in a much better way how to think about tax changes and what impact they might have. Final issue is issues of tax enforcement and tax administration. We know that tax enforcement and tax administration are important. When governments issue regulations, when they issue guidance to taxpayers, when governments adopt general anti-abuse rules, when they require transfer pricing documentation, when they impose limitations on what counts as a deductible expense or a creditable foreign tax, or all of these issues, a host, 1,001 issues like that, we know they have consequences. They surely have efficiency consequences. They surely have incidence consequences. Somebody bears the burden of these actions. Somebody's actions are affected by these government enforcement and administration actions. Well, we should analyze them the same way we do statutory provisions. We're using our standard tools of thinking about how efficient are they, what consequences do they have, who bears the burden of these things. I don't see why they should be any different than changing the statutory rate or changing various base definitions. Yet, typically that has been left out of the research canon for no good reason, and we could much better inform tax practice if we had better estimates of the consequences of these things. So I will say that if any place can answer these questions, it probably is the Center for Business Taxation at the University of Oxford, and I look forward to seeing the answers on your website.